The wind howled like a wounded animal across the frozen landscape of northern Afghanistan, carrying with it the promise of death for anyone caught unprepared. Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez pulled her tactical gloves tighter as she scanned the horizon through her binoculars, the metal so cold it seemed to burn through the fabric. The observation post they had established on the ridge overlooked a valley that intelligence suggested was a major Taliban supply route. But for 3 days now, nothing had moved except the relentless snow. Visibility's down to maybe 50 meters, she reported into her radio, her breath forming crystals in the frigid air. Still no movement in the valley. General Marcus Hayes's voice crackled back through the static, tinged with the frustration that had been building for weeks. Roger that, Rodriguez. Maintain position. Command believes they're waiting for the storm to pass before moving their weapons cache. Elena lowered the radio and settled back against the sandbags that formed their makeshift shelter. Beside her, Corporal Jamie Chun was cleaning his rifle for the third time that morning, a nervous habit he'd developed during their deployment. The other members of their small reconnaissance team huddled deeper into their positions, trying to conserve body heat while remaining alert. The blizzard had begun 2 nights ago, transforming their routine surveillance mission into a test of survival. What should have been a simple 3-day observation had stretched into something far more dangerous as the storm intensified beyond all weather predictions. The temperature had dropped to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind chill made it feel even colder. Elena's thoughts drifted to the letter she'd received from her younger sister Maria just before this mission. Maria was starting her senior year of high school back in San Antonio, worried about college applications and prom dates. Problems that seemed so distant from this frozen hell that Elena almost couldn't remember what normal teenage concerns felt like. She joined the Army at 18, driven by a combination of patriotism and the need to escape the poverty that had defined her childhood in the housing projects of South San Antonio. "Sarge, you think they're really going to try to move through this weather?" Chun asked, his voice barely audible over the wind. Elena considered the question carefully. She'd been in Afghanistan for 2 tours now, and she'd learned that the enemy was nothing if not adaptable. They've been planning this weapons transfer for months, according to intel. A storm like this provides perfect cover. Nobody expects movement in these conditions. The truth was more complicated than she let on. Elena had been studying the Taliban's patterns for months, and she noticed something that the intelligence officers back at base seemed to have missed. The enemy had been increasingly bold in their movements, particularly during adverse weather conditions. They'd learned to use nature as an ally, moving when American forces were most likely to be grounded or seeking shelter. As if summoned by her thoughts, a faint sound drifted across the wind. Elena grabbed her binoculars again, straining to see through the swirling snow. At first, she thought it might be wishful thinking or the wind playing tricks, but then she saw it, a convoy of vehicles moving slowly through the valley below, their headlights barely visible through the storm. "Contact," she whispered urgently into her radio. "We have vehicles moving through the valley. Count is 6, maybe 7 trucks." The radio exploded with activity as her report reached the chain of command. General Hayes's voice cut through the chatter with military precision. "Rodriguez, confirm the count and composition. We need exact numbers." Elena adjusted her binoculars, trying to get a clearer view through the blowing snow. The vehicles were moving in single file, following what appeared to be a predetermined path through the valley. "I count 7 trucks, sir. Mixed composition. Looks like they're heavily loaded." "Outstanding work, Rodriguez. Maintain observation and report any changes. We're scrambling air support, but with this weather..." Hayes's voice trailed off, leaving the obvious unsaid. No aircraft would be able to fly in these conditions. As Elena continued her observation, she became aware of a change in the team's dynamic. The lethargy that had settled over them during the long, cold wait was replaced by focused tension. This was what they'd been trained for, what they'd been waiting for during those 3 miserable days. Corporal Johnson, their communications specialist, was busy coordinating with command while Private Torres maintained watch on their flanks. The youngest member of their team, 19-year-old Private Williams, was checking his ammunition for the fourth time, his hands shaking slightly from either cold or nerves. The lead truck's stopping, Elena reported, watching as the convoy came to a halt roughly 800 meters from their position. Looks like they're setting up some kind of checkpoint or transfer point. Through her binoculars, she could see figures moving around the vehicles, unloading what appeared to be heavy containers. The intelligence had been correct. This was a major weapons transfer, happening right in the middle of the worst blizzard Afghanistan had seen in years. General Hayes's voice returned to the radio, now carrying an edge of excitement mixed with concern. Rodriguez, we need you to maintain eyes on that position. We're working on getting ground support to your location, but it's going to take time in these conditions. Elena acknowledged the order, but privately she wondered how any reinforcements would reach them. The roads leading to their position were likely impassable, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. They were essentially on their own, 6 soldiers watching what appeared to be a significant enemy operation unfold below them. As the hours passed, the activity in the valley intensified. More vehicles arrived, and Elena counted at least 30 enemy combatants moving around the transfer site. They were well organized and clearly familiar with the terrain, working efficiently despite the harsh conditions. Sarge, Chen whispered, they've got some serious firepower down there. I can see at least 2 heavy machine guns, maybe more. Elena nodded grimly. Their small reconnaissance team was equipped for observation and light engagement, not for taking on a force of this size. But as she watched the weapons transfer continue below, she realized they might not have a choice in the matter. The first sign of trouble came when Private Torres, monitoring their rear security, reported movement on the ridge behind them. Possible contacts approaching from the north, he reported quietly. Can't get a clear visual through the snow, but I'm seeing movement. Elena felt her stomach tighten. If the enemy had spotted their observation post, they could be surrounded and outnumbered 10-1. She made a quick decision, splitting her attention between the valley operation and the potential threat to their rear. Johnson, get on the radio to command. Tell them we might have been compromised. Chun, Torres, establish a defensive perimeter. Williams, stay on the valley observation. As her team moved into defensive positions, Elena realized that their routine surveillance mission had just become something much more dangerous. They were potentially trapped on a ridge in the middle of a blizzard, with a superior enemy force below them and unknown contacts approaching from behind. The snow continued to fall, creating a white curtain that limited visibility and muffled sound. In the eerie quiet between wind gusts, Elena could hear her own heartbeat and the metallic clicks of her team checking their weapons. Every soldier knew this feeling, the moment when a mission shifted from routine to potentially deadly. Command, this is Rodriguez. She spoke into her radio, her voice steady despite the situation. We have possible enemy movement to our rear and a major weapons transfer ongoing in the valley. Request immediate instructions. The radio crackled with static for what felt like an eternity before General Hayes's voice returned. Rodriguez, you are to maintain position and continue observation until relieved. Ground support is en route, but weather conditions are hampering movement. Elena understood the subtext. They were on their own for the foreseeable future. She looked at her team, 5 young soldiers who trusted her to get them through whatever was coming. Chun was methodically checking his rifle scope, while Torres had found a position where he could cover their rear approach. Johnson was trying to maintain radio contact with increasingly distant command posts. Williams, despite being the youngest, was steady at his observation post, tracking the activity in the valley below. The wind picked up again, driving snow horizontally across the ridge and reducing visibility to almost zero. In moments like these, Elena remembered her drill sergeant's words from basic training. When everything goes to hell, fall back on your training and trust your team. It was advice that had served her well through 2 combat deployments. As if responding to some unseen signal, the enemy activity in the valley suddenly increased. Vehicles began moving again, and Elena could see figures running between the trucks. Something had changed in their operation, and she suspected it might be related to the movement Torres had detected behind them. "Williams, what's the status in the valley?" she asked quietly. "They're loading up fast, Sarge. Looks like they might be preparing to move out ahead of schedule." Elena made a quick tactical assessment. If the enemy in the valley was preparing to leave and there were hostiles approaching their position from behind, her team might be caught in a coordinated trap. The observation mission was about to become a fight for survival. She keyed her radio once more. "Command, Rodriguez. Enemy is accelerating operations in the valley, and we have confirmed movement to our rear. We may be about to engage." General Hayes's response was immediate and sharp. "Rodriguez, your orders are to observe and report. Do not engage unless directly threatened. Repeat, do not initiate contact." Elena acknowledged the order, but as she looked through her binoculars at the weapons being loaded into the trucks below, she wondered if following orders might mean allowing a significant enemy operation to succeed. The intelligence value of what they were observing was enormous, but they were also potentially watching enough weapons being moved to arm insurgent operations for months. The decision was taken out of her hands when Private Torres's urgent whisper came through her earpiece. "Contact rear 100 meters and closing. At least 8 combatants, moving in tactical formation." Elena's training kicked in. Whatever orders she'd received from command, her first responsibility was to her team. The enemy knew they were here, and there was no longer any question about whether they would have to fight. "All positions, weapons free," she ordered quietly. "Torres, can you get a clear shot?" "Negative, visibility is too poor. But they're definitely coming this way." Elena realized that the storm, which had been their enemy for 3 days, was about to become their ally. The poor visibility that had made observation difficult would also make it harder for a superior enemy force to coordinate an effective attack. If they could use the terrain and weather to their advantage, they might be able to hold out until support arrived. The sound of approaching footsteps crunching through snow was barely audible over the wind, but Elena's experienced ears picked it up. The enemy was close now, perhaps 50 meters away, and closing. She could feel the tension in her team as they prepared for contact. In the valley below, the weapons transfer continued despite the approaching battle on the ridge above. Elena realized that her team had stumbled into something much larger than a routine intelligence gathering mission. They were witnesses to a significant enemy operation, and now they were fighting for their lives to report what they'd seen. The first shot came from Torres's position, the sound sharp and clear despite the muffling effect of the snow. "Contact confirmed," he reported. "They're taking cover, but still advancing." Elena knew that once the shooting started, there would be no going back. Their small team was about to face a larger enemy force in some of the worst weather conditions imaginable. Everything would depend on their training, their teamwork, and their ability to use the terrain and weather to level an uneven fight. As she prepared to engage the enemy, Elena thought briefly of her sister Maria, safe in San Antonio and worried about high school problems. There was an entire world of normal life that existed beyond this frozen ridge, beyond the sound of gunfire and the immediate question of survival. But right now, in this moment, there was only the mission, her team, and the approaching enemy. The blizzard continued to rage around them, indifferent to human conflict, as Elena Rodriguez prepared to discover what she was truly made of. The firefight erupted with sudden violence that cut through the storm like thunder. Elena dubbed behind the sandbag barrier as bullets whined overhead, their deadly whispers almost lost in the howling wind. The enemy had approached closer than anticipated, using the blizzard as cover just as effectively as her team had hoped to. "Torres, report," she shouted over the gunfire. "Multiple contacts, at least 10 now. They're trying to flank us from the north ridge." Torres's rifle cracked repeatedly as he engaged targets Elena couldn't see through the swirling snow. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. What had begun as a simple observation mission was now a desperate defensive action against a superior force. Elena's mind raced through their options, none of which looked promising. They were outnumbered, isolated, and fighting in conditions that made communication and coordination nearly impossible. Johnson, get command on the radio. Tell them we're in heavy contact and need immediate support. Elena ordered while returning fire at muzzle flashes she could barely distinguish through the storm. Johnson was already working his radio, but the response he got made Elena's heart sink. Sarge, command says the closest ground support is still 4 hours out, maybe more. The roads are completely blocked by snow drifts. For hours. Elena knew they didn't have 4 minutes at their current rate of ammunition expenditure, let alone 4 hours. She quickly assessed their tactical situation. The enemy had the advantage of numbers and apparently knew the terrain well enough to maneuver in zero visibility conditions. Her team's only advantages were their defensive position and their superior training. Chun, Williams, establish interlocking fields of fire. Make every shot count, she instructed. We're going to be here for a while. As if to emphasize the gravity of their situation, a rocket-propelled grenade suddenly streaked out of the snow and exploded against the rocks 20 meters to their left. The blast sent shards of frozen stone spinning through the air, and Elena felt something hot streak across her cheek. RPG, Torres called out unnecessarily. They've got us bracketed. Elena wiped blood from the cut on her face and tried to think tactically. The enemy was probing their defenses, trying to determine their exact positions and strength. Once they figured out how small Elena's team actually was, they would likely launch a coordinated assault that would overwhelm their position. Through her earpiece, she heard General Hayes's voice crackling through the static. Rodriguez, Sitrep, we're monitoring your frequency. Heavy contact, sir. Estimate platoon-sized enemy force with RPGs. We're holding, but ammunition is limited, Elena reported while ducking as another burst of automatic weapons fire raked their position. Rodriguez, your mission is intelligence gathering. Can you confirm the status of the weapons transfer in the valley? Elena almost couldn't believe what she was hearing. Even as her team fought for their lives, command was still focused on the intelligence mission. She risked a quick glance toward the valley through her binoculars and saw that the weapons transfer was continuing despite the firefight on the ridge above. Transfer is ongoing, sir. Enemy appears to be using our contact as a diversion to complete their operation. Outstanding. Maintain observation if possible. Elena wanted to ask the general if he was insane, but military discipline ran too deep. Instead, she focused on keeping her team alive, while somehow continuing to gather intelligence on an operation that might determine the course of insurgent activities for months to come. The next hour was a blur of gunfire, shouted orders, and the constant struggle to maintain defensive positions in increasingly difficult conditions. The blizzard showed no signs of letting up, and, if anything, the wind was getting stronger. Elena found herself fighting two enemies. The humans trying to kill her team, and the weather trying to freeze them to death. Private Williams, despite being the youngest member of the team, was proving himself under fire. His rifle work was precise and methodical, and he'd managed to maintain observation on the valley even while engaging enemy positions. Sarge, they're starting to load the last trucks down there. Looks like they might be wrapping up soon. Elena acknowledged the report while changing magazines on her rifle. If the weapons transfer was nearly complete, it meant their intelligence mission was almost accomplished. But it also meant that the enemy forces engaging them might soon be reinforced by the fighters from the Valley operation. Chun, how's our ammunition situation? Chun did a quick count of remaining magazines. We're down to about 40%, Sarge. At this rate of fire, maybe another hour before we're in serious trouble. Elena made a tactical decision that went against every instinct she had. All positions conserve ammunition. Controlled pairs only, and only at targets you can clearly identify. We need to make what we have last. The reduced rate of fire from her team seemed to encourage the enemy, who immediately increased their own volume of fire. Bullets struck the sandbags, and rocks around their position with increasing frequency, and Elena realized that slowing down their defensive fire might have been a mistake. That's when Private Torres made the call that changed everything. "Sarge, I've got a clear shot on what looks like their leader. About 200 meters near that outcropping of rocks." Elena squinted through her scope, but couldn't make out any individual targets through the blowing snow. Torres had always had exceptional eyesight, even in poor conditions. If he said he had a shot, she believed him. "Take it," she ordered. Torres's rifle cracked once, and immediately the volume of enemy fire decreased noticeably. A few moments later, Elena could hear shouting in what sounded like Pashto, and the enemy fire became less coordinated. "Nice shot, Torres. Looks like you disrupted their command structure." The temporary lull in enemy fire gave Elena a chance to reassess their situation. They were still outnumbered and running low on ammunition, but the enemy seemed to have lost some of their coordination. It might be enough to buy them the time they needed for support to arrive. That's when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Through a brief gap in the blowing snow, she could see movement in the valley that suggested the weapons transfer was complete. But instead of the convoy departing as she'd expected, some of the vehicles were turning and heading toward the base of their ridge. "Williams, confirm movement in the valley. Are some of those vehicles heading our way?" Williams adjusted his position to get a better view downslope. "Confirmed, Sarge. At least 3 vehicles with what looks like a full squad in each one. They're going to try to hit us from below, while the others keep us pinned from above." Elena realized they were about to face a coordinated assault from 2 directions. Her team of 6 soldiers was about to be attacked by what could be 30 or more enemy fighters with superior numbers, better knowledge of the terrain, and now tactical coordination between 2 separate forces. She keyed her radio to command. "General Hayes, we are about to be engaged by forces from 2 directions. The Valley operation has redeployed some of their fighters to support the assault on our position." Hayes's response was immediate. "Rodriguez, can you hold your position?" Elena looked around at her team. Chan was methodically cleaning blood from shrapnel cut on his arm while checking his remaining ammunition. Torres was scanning for targets through scope, calm, and focused despite their desperate situation. Johnson was still working his radio, trying to reach any friendly units that might be able to provide support. Williams continued to track enemy movements in both the valley and on the ridge above them, reporting changes in tactical situation with the precision of a veteran soldier despite his youth. "Sir, we'll hold as long as we can," Elena replied, knowing it might be the last report she ever made. The assault began 10 minutes later with a coordinated barrage of RPGs and automatic weapons fire from both the ridge above and the valley approach below. The enemy had clearly learned from their earlier probing attacks and was now applying maximum pressure to her defensive positions. Elena found herself moving constantly between positions, trying to direct her team's defensive fire while gathering intelligence on enemy movements and maintaining communication with command. It was becoming impossible to do all 3 effectively, and she realized that something would have to give. All positions, priority is staying alive. Intelligence gathering is secondary until we can stabilize the tactical situation, she ordered. But even as she said it, Elena continued to monitor the valley through her binoculars whenever she had a moment between engaging enemy fighters. The intelligence they'd gathered was crucial, but it would be meaningless if none of them survived to report it. The sound of the battle was strange in the blizzard conditions. Gunfire seemed to come from every direction and no direction at once, muffled and distorted by the wind and snow. Elena found herself relying more on muzzle flashes and the impacts of incoming rounds than on sound to determine where threats were coming from. "Grenade!" Chun shouted, and Elena dove behind a boulder as an explosion rocked their position. Shrapnel whined overhead, and when the smoke cleared, she saw that Private Williams had been hit. Elena crawled over to where Williams lay bleeding from wounds in his shoulder and leg. Despite his injuries, he was still trying to maintain observation on the valley below. "Williams, let me see those wounds." "I am okay, Sarge." Still got eyes on the valley. The convoy is starting to move out now. Elena quickly assessed his injuries while keeping one eye on the tactical situation. The shoulder wound was bleeding freely, but didn't appear to have hit any major blood vessels. The leg wound was more concerning, but Williams was still mobile. "Chun, get over here with the medical kit," she called out. As Chun provided first aid to Williams, Elena realized that her team was slowly being whittled down by superior numbers and firepower. They needed to do something to change the tactical dynamic, or they would be overrun within the next hour. That's when she noticed the M24 sniper rifle that Torres had been carrying as secondary weapon. In all the confusion of the firefight, she'd almost forgotten about it. The weapon had much better range and accuracy than their standard rifles, but Torres was fully occupied with close-range defensive fire. Elena made a decision that surprised even herself. She'd qualified as an expert marksman in basic training, but she'd never used a sniper rifle in actual combat. However, with Williams wounded and their ammunition running low, desperate situations called for desperate measures. "Torres, I need that M24, she called out. Torres looked at her with surprise. "Sarge, you qualified on a long gun?" "Qualified enough. Keep up the defensive fire with your carbine." As Elena positioned herself with the sniper rifle, she could see General Hayes would later question how a staff sergeant trained in reconnaissance had ended up in a sniper position during a firefight. But right now, all that mattered was giving her team a chance to survive until help arrived. The scope on the M24 gave her a much clearer view of the battlefield despite the blowing snow. For the first time since the firefight began, she could clearly see individual enemy positions and assess their tactical deployment. What she saw made her realize that her team's situation was even worse than she'd thought, but it also showed her something that might save their lives. Through the M24 scope, Elena could see what her team's desperate situation truly looked like. The enemy had positioned themselves in a nearly perfect tactical formation, with interlocking fields of fire that covered every possible avenue of escape from their ridge position. But she also spotted something that gave her hope. A cluster of enemy fighters gathered around what appeared to be their command post, partially sheltered behind an outcropping of rocks about 400 meters away. Elena had never taken a shot at this distance under combat conditions, let alone in a blizzard with winds gusting up to 40 miles per hour. But she also knew that disrupting the enemy's command structure might be their only chance of survival. "Johnson, what's the wind direction and speed?" she asked while adjusting the scope settings. Johnson pulled out a small weather gauge he carried for radio operations. "Winds coming from the northwest, gusting between 35 and 45 miles per hour." Elena tried to remember her long-range shooting training from years ago. Wind compensation at 400 meters in these conditions would require significant adjustment to her point of aim. She also had to account for the cold affecting her rifle's ballistics and the adrenaline affecting her breathing and heart rate. As she lined up her shot, Elena could hear the radio chatter between General Hayes and other command elements discussing their situation. The conversation was not encouraging. "Air support is grounded indefinitely due to weather conditions," she heard someone report. "Ground convoy is stuck in snow drifts approximately 15 kilometers from their position. Estimated time of arrival is now 6 to 8 hours. 6 to 8 hours. Elena knew they had maybe 30 minutes of ammunition remaining at their current rate of expenditure. The enemy seemed to understand this as well, because their fire was becoming more aggressive and coordinated. "Torres, Chun, give me covering fire on the ridge positions," Elena ordered as she settled into a proper shooting position behind the M24. "I'm going to try to take out their command element." Through the scope, she could see 3 figures who appeared to be coordinating the enemy assault. One of them was speaking into what looked like a radio, while another was pointing toward different positions and giving orders to nearby fighters. Elena controlled her breathing, tried to slow her heart rate despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The first rule of long-range shooting was patience, but patience was a luxury they couldn't afford in their current situation. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and through the scope she saw one of the enemy commanders drop. Immediately, the radio chatter among enemy positions became confused and agitated. "Good shot, Sarge," Torres called out. "Their fire is getting disorganized." But Elena knew that one shot wouldn't be enough to break up the assault. She worked the bolt on the M24 and acquired her next target, another figure who appeared to be trying to take command of the operation. This shot was more difficult because the wind had shifted and the target was partially concealed behind cover. Elena had to wait for the right moment when the figure exposed himself enough to provide a clear shot. The opportunity came when the enemy commander moved to get a better view of their positions. Elena exhaled slowly, held her breath, and squeezed the trigger again. The second shot was equally successful, and the enemy fire became noticeably less coordinated. But now Elena faced a new problem. The enemy had identified her position and was directing concentrated fire at her location. Bullets struck the rocks around her position with increasing frequency, sending chips of stone flying through the air. She had to abandon the M24's fixed position and find new cover, which meant losing the tactical advantage the long-range weapon had provided. "All positions, we need to relocate," Elena ordered. "They've got our current positions bracketed." Moving during a firefight was one of the most dangerous tactical maneuvers, especially when outnumbered and under heavy fire. But staying in their current positions meant being slowly worn down by superior firepower until they were overrun. Elena grabbed the M24 and low-crawled to a new position about 20 meters to the right of their original defensive line. The movement took her across exposed ground, and she could hear bullets cracking overhead as enemy fighters tracked her movement. Williams, despite his wounds, managed to move to a new position while maintaining observation on the valley. "Sarge, the convoy is moving out now, but they've left behind a rear guard to support the assault on our position." The tactical picture was becoming clearer to Elena. The enemy weapons transfer was essentially complete, and now they were willing to commit significant resources to eliminating the American observation team that had witnessed their operation. Her team had become more than just observers. They were now the primary obstacle to the enemy completing their mission successfully. From her new position, Elena could see that the enemy assault was entering a new phase. Instead of the probing attacks they'd been conducting, she could see fighters massing for what appeared to be a coordinated rush on their positions. "Contact front, multiple fighters advancing," Torres called out. "They're making a push." Elena quickly assessed their ammunition situation. Each team member had maybe 2 magazines remaining, enough for perhaps 10 minutes of sustained defensive fire. After that, they would be reduced to whatever weapons they could scavenge from fallen enemies. But the M24 still had a full magazine of match-grade ammunition, and Elena realized that the long-range weapon might be their key to survival. If she could use it effectively, she might be able to break up the enemy assault before it reached their positions. She found a new firing position that gave her a clear field of fire across the approach routes the enemy would have to use. The wind had died down slightly, which improved her shooting conditions, but visibility was still severely limited by the blowing snow. Through the scope, Elena could see approximately 15 enemy fighters advancing in what appeared to be a coordinated assault formation. They were using proper fire and movement techniques, with some fighters providing covering fire while others advanced. Elena selected her first target, a fighter who appeared to be leading the assault element. At a range of about 200 meters, wind compensation was less critical, but she still had to account for the target's movement and the challenging visibility conditions. She fired, and the enemy fighter dropped. Immediately, the assault formation became confused as fighters sought cover and tried to determine where the shot had come from. Elena worked the bolt and acquired a second target, another fighter who was trying to rally the assault. This shot was more difficult because the target was moving and partially concealed behind sparse cover. She led the target slightly to account for his movement, held her breath, and fired. The shot struck the fighter's center mass, and the enemy assault began to lose momentum. But Elena knew that disrupting one assault wouldn't end their tactical problems. The enemy still had superior numbers and could afford to take casualties that her team couldn't sustain. They needed to find a way to change the entire dynamic of the engagement. "Johnson, are you getting anything from command on support?" Elena asked while scanning for her next target. "Negative, Sarge. They're still working on getting ground support through the snow, but it's going to be hours." Elena made a decision that would later be debated in after-action reports for months. Instead of continuing to fight a purely defensive engagement, she decided to take the initiative. "Chun, Torres, I want you to lay down suppressive fire on the ridge positions. Williams, despite your wounds, I need you to maintain observation on our flanks. Johnson, keep working that radio." "What are you planning, Sarge?" Chun asked. Elena studied the battlefield through the M24 scope, identifying enemy positions and planning an approach that would have seemed impossible under normal circumstances. But nothing about their situation was normal. "I'm going to move to an advanced position and try to break up their coordination completely," she announced. Torres looked at her with concern. "Sarge, that's extremely dangerous in these conditions." Elena knew he was right, but she also knew that continuing their current defensive posture would result in their being overrun within the hour. Sometimes the most dangerous course of action was actually the safest. "Cover me," she ordered, and before anyone could argue, she was moving. Elena's advance across the snow-covered ridge was unlike anything she'd experienced in 2 previous combat deployments. The combination of enemy fire, zero visibility conditions, and the need to carry the heavy M24 while maintaining tactical movement made every meter a struggle. She used the terrain and limited visibility to mask her movement, advancing in short rushes between cover positions. The wind was so strong that it actually helped conceal the sound of her movement, but it also made it difficult to hear enemy positions. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes, Elena reached a position that gave her a commanding view of the main enemy assembly area. Through the scope, she could see that the fighters were regrouping for another assault, and this time they appeared to have brought additional weapons, including what looked like a heavy machine gun. Elena realized that if the enemy deployed the heavy machine gun effectively, it would make her team's defensive position untenable. She had to neutralize the weapon before it could be brought into action. The machine gun crew was approximately 300 meters away, partially concealed behind natural cover, but visible enough to provide a shot if she could time it correctly. Elena settled into a stable shooting position and began the careful process of lining up what might be the most important shot of her military career. As she prepared to fire, Elena could hear General Hayes' voice on the radio, coordinating with various command elements about their situation. The conversation confirmed what she already knew. Her team was essentially on their own for the immediate future, and their survival depended entirely on their ability to hold off a superior enemy force in impossible conditions. Elena took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and prepared to take the shot that would determine whether her team lived or died in the Afghan blizzard. Elena's finger hovered over the trigger as she watched the enemy machine gun crew through the M24 scope. The wind had momentarily died down, creating a brief window of improved visibility. She could see 3 fighters setting up what appeared to be a Soviet-era PKM machine gun, a weapon capable of suppressing her entire team's position with devastating effectiveness. She centered the crosshairs on the gunner and slowly squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and through the scope she saw the enemy fighter collapse. Immediately, the other crew members scrambled for cover, leaving the heavy weapon unmanned. But Elena's advanced position had exposed her to enemy observation, and now she found herself under direct fire from multiple positions. Bullets cracked overhead and struck the rocks around her, forcing her to abandon her current firing position and seek better cover. As she moved, Elena could hear General Hayes's voice crackling through her earpiece, though the transmission was breaking up due to the weather conditions. Rodriguez, heavy casualties, recommend tactical withdrawal. Elena couldn't make out the entire message, but the implication was clear. Command was suggesting that her team abandon their position and attempt to escape through the blizzard. Under normal circumstances, it might have been sound tactical advice, but Elena knew that attempting to move across open terrain in zero visibility conditions while being pursued by a superior force would be suicide. She keyed her radio while diving behind a boulder as another burst of automatic fire raked her position. Command, Rodriguez, cannot comply with withdrawal recommendation. Terrain and weather conditions make movement impossible. We will hold current position. The response was immediate and sharp. General Hayes's voice cut through the static with unmistakable authority. Rodriguez, that was not a recommendation. You are ordered to withdraw immediately. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperature. She was being given a direct order by a general officer, but every instinct she developed through years of combat experience told her that following that order would kill her entire team. Sir, respectfully request clarification. Weather and tactical conditions make withdrawal extremely hazardous. Rodriguez, the intelligence you've gathered is complete. The weapons transfer has been documented. Your mission is accomplished. Withdraw to the rally point immediately. Elena realized that from General Hayes's perspective, safe in a heated command post miles away from the fighting, the tactical equation looked simple. The intelligence mission was complete, so the logical next step was to extract the team before they took casualties. But Hayes couldn't see what Elena could see through the M24 scope. The enemy wasn't just defending a completed weapons transfer. They were actively hunting her team with the clear intention of eliminating any witnesses to their operation. Attempting to withdraw would expose her team to pursuit across open terrain in conditions where they couldn't see more than 50 meters in any direction. Elena made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. She looked through the scope at the enemy positions, then at her team members who were continuing to fight with disciplined precision despite being outnumbered and running low on ammunition. Sir, unable to comply. Enemy is actively pursuing. Withdrawal would expose team to unacceptable risk. The radio went silent for several long moments. When Hayes's voice returned, it carried a tone that Elena had never heard before. Barely controlled fury. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, you're directly disobeying a lawful order from a general officer. Withdraw your team immediately or face court-martial proceedings. Elena felt the weight of the moment. She was a career soldier who had never disobeyed an order in 8 years of military service. But she also knew that good soldiers had died following bad orders, and she would not let her team become casualties of poor command decisions made by officers who couldn't see the tactical reality on the ground. Sir, I understand the consequences of my decision. We will hold our position. Elena switched off her radio to prevent further argument and focused on the immediate tactical situation. Through the scope, she could see that the enemy was regrouping for another assault, but this time they appeared to be taking a different approach. Instead of the frontal assault they'd attempted earlier, the fighters were now moving to envelope her team's position from multiple directions. Elena realized that while she'd been arguing with command, the enemy had been using the time to improve their tactical positioning. All positions were about to be hit from 3 directions, she warned her team. Conserve ammunition and make every shot count. Torres acknowledged the warning while engaging targets on the eastern approach. Despite the impossible conditions, his shooting remained precise and effective. Chun was providing covering fire while treating Williams's wounds with whatever medical supplies they had remaining. Johnson continued monitoring radio frequencies, hoping to reach any friendly units that might be able to provide support. Elena scanned the battlefield through the M24 scope, identifying priority targets and trying to disrupt the enemy's coordination. She could see approximately 20 fighters moving through positions that would allow them to attack her team from angles their defensive position couldn't cover effectively. The situation was becoming desperate, but Elena noticed something that gave her an idea. The enemy's advanced positions were in areas where the ridge's natural contours would make them vulnerable to flanking fire from a different angle. If she could reach a position about 100 meters to the north of their current defensive line, she might be able to engage the enemy from an unexpected direction. "Chun, take tactical command of the position," Elena ordered. "I'm going to try to get behind their advance elements." Chun looked at her with concern. "Sarge, that's a lot of open ground to cover under fire." Elena knew he was right, but she also knew that staying in their current position meant being slowly surrounded and eventually overrun. Sometimes survival required accepting enormous risks to avoid certain death. "Cover my movement for the first 50 meters, then focus on your own defensive fires," Elena instructed. Elena's movement across the ridge was a nightmare of crawling through snow, diving between cover positions, and trying to maintain her bearings in near-zero visibility conditions. The M24 was heavy and awkward to maneuver while low crawling, but she knew the weapon would be essential once she reached her new position. Several times during the movement, enemy fighters passed within meters of her position without detecting her presence. The blizzard that had made their mission miserable was now saving her life by concealing her movement from enemy observation. When she finally reached the position she'd been seeking, Elena was exhausted and half-frozen, but she had a clear field of fire into the enemy's flank positions. Through the scope, she could see fighters moving in tactical formation toward her team's original defensive position, unaware that they were now exposed to fire from an unexpected angle. Elena selected her first target, a fighter who appeared to be directing the flanking movement. At a range of approximately 150 meters, the shot was well within her capabilities even in the challenging conditions. The rifle cracked, and the enemy fighter dropped. Immediately, the flanking movement became confused as fighters sought cover and tried to determine where the shot had originated. Elena worked the bolt and acquired her second target, another fighter who was trying to rally the advance. This shot was successful as well, and the enemy's coordinated assault began to fall apart as unit cohesion broke down. From her new position, Elena could also observe the main valley where the weapons transfer had taken place. Most of the convoy had departed, but she could see that several vehicles remained, apparently waiting for the assault team to complete their mission against her observation post. Elena realized that her team had become more than witnesses to an enemy operation. They had become the final objective. The enemy couldn't afford to let them escape with the intelligence they'd gathered, which meant this engagement would continue until one side or the other was completely eliminated. Through her earpiece, Elena could hear radio traffic between various command elements discussing her situation. General Hayes was clearly coordinating with higher headquarters about her refusal to follow orders, but she also heard other voices arguing that her tactical assessment might be correct. "Rodriguez, this is Colonel Martinez," a new voice cut through the radio chatter. "I'm taking operational control of your situation. Maintain your position and continue engaging enemy forces." Elena felt a surge of relief. Colonel Martinez had been her battalion commander during her first deployment, and she trusted his tactical judgment completely. If he was taking control of the situation, it meant someone at higher headquarters understood the reality of their tactical position. "Roger, sir. Maintaining position and engaging enemy forces." "Outstanding, Rodriguez. Ground support is en route, but weather conditions are still hampering movement. You need to hold for at least another 2 hours." 2 hours. Elena quickly calculated their remaining ammunition and realized they would be cutting it extremely close. But at least now she had confirmation that someone in the command structure understood their situation and was working to get them support. Elena continued engaging enemy positions from her flanking position, using the M24's superior range and accuracy to disrupt their tactical coordination. Each successful shot forced the enemy to adjust their approach, buying precious time for her team. As the firefight continued, Elena began to notice changes in the enemy's behavior that suggested they were becoming increasingly desperate to complete their mission. Instead of the disciplined tactical movements they displayed earlier, The fighters were now taking greater risks and exposing themselves to her team's defensive fire. Torres, Chun, they're getting sloppy, Elena observed over the radio. Take advantage of any opportunities you get. The next phase of the battle was a grinding test of endurance, training, and determination. Elena's team, despite being outnumbered and running low on ammunition, continued to hold their positions and exact a heavy toll on the attacking force. The M24 proved to be a decisive factor, allowing Elena to engage targets at ranges where the enemy couldn't effectively return fire. But Elena knew that their situation remained precarious. The enemy still had superior numbers and could afford to take casualties that her team couldn't sustain. Every bullet her team fired brought them closer to being completely out of ammunition, while the enemy seemed to have unlimited supplies. That's when Elena heard the sound that changed everything. The distant rumble of helicopters approaching through the storm. All positions, friendly air support inbound. Colonel Martinez's voice crackled through the radio. Mark your positions with infrared strobes and take cover. Elena felt tears freezing on her cheeks as she activated her IR strobe. After hours of desperate fighting in impossible conditions, help was finally arriving. But she also knew that the next few minutes would be the most dangerous of the entire engagement, as desperate enemy fighters might attempt to overrun their positions before air support could engage. Through the M24 scope, Elena could see enemy fighters beginning to retreat toward the valley, abandoning their assault on her team's position. The sound of approaching helicopters had clearly changed their tactical calculus. Rodriguez, this is Apache lead. A new voice came through her earpiece. We have visual on your IR strobes. Can you mark enemy positions? Elena quickly identified the retreating enemy positions and provided targeting information to the helicopter crews. Within minutes, the ridge was lit up by rocket and cannon fire as the Apache gunships engaged the enemy forces that had been attacking her team. The sound of the helicopter's weapons was almost drowned out by the wind, but Elena could see the effects through her scope. Enemy positions that had been sources of concentrated fire just minutes earlier were now silent and smoking. Apache lead, Rodriguez. Enemy forces are withdrawing toward the valley. Be advised there are vehicles in the valley that supported the assault on our position. Roger, Rodriguez. We have eyes on the vehicles. Engaging now. Elena watched through her scope as the Apache helicopters engaged the remaining enemy vehicles in the valley, completing the destruction of the weapons transfer operation that her team had risked everything to observe and report. As the sound of helicopter weapons fire faded and the enemy retreat became a rout, Elena realized that her decision to disobey General Hayes's order had been vindicated. If her team had attempted to withdraw when ordered, they would have been caught in the open and likely killed. By holding their position and continuing to fight, they had not only survived but had provided the targeting information that allowed the air support to completely destroy the enemy operation. Colonel Martinez's voice came through the radio with obvious relief. Rodriguez, outstanding work. Ground support will reach your position within the hour for extraction. Elena keyed her radio for what she knew might be her final transmission as a staff sergeant. Roger, sir. Mission accomplished. As she began the process of consolidating her team and preparing for extraction, Elena reflected on the events of the past several hours. She had disobeyed a direct order from a general officer, used a weapon she wasn't officially qualified on, and led her team through a desperate firefight against overwhelming odds. The consequences for her career would likely be severe, but as she looked at her team members, all alive and preparing for extraction, Elena knew she had made the right choice. Sometimes being a good soldier meant knowing when not to follow orders, and sometimes survival required taking risks that no training manual could adequately describe. General Hayes would later demand a full investigation into her conduct, but Colonel Martinez and higher headquarters would ultimately conclude that her tactical judgment had been correct and that her actions had saved both her team and the intelligence mission. The blizzard continued to rage around them as they waited for extraction, but Elena Rodriguez had discovered something about herself that would define the rest of her military career. When everything went wrong and impossible decisions had to be made, she could be counted on to put her soldiers first and find a way to complete the mission, regardless of the personal cost.